Thank you everyone for coming to our offices today. I will share some reflections on what has been spoken about, but actually also in addition I was asked to give some thoughts about the role of carbon reporting in this particular agenda. So I think from Secretary Yao we heard about some really interesting initiatives that are going on locally, particularly in relation to infrastructure and the built environment. And from the Commissioner, not only did we hear about some of the complexities that are involved in climate change and addressing it, but specifically within consideration of the EU ETS, ways that we can also bring in other sectors beyond those, the largest emitters that fall within the EU ETS. And I think the role of reporting and delivering action on action on climate change is one of the ways in which we can begin to pull in these other sectors. So I'm going to talk about that in the context of Hong Kong and wider regions. And I'm going to highlight in particular why I believe that the direction of travel is clear here and regionally. But at the same time, the policies and mechanisms that are really required to deliver on this remain uncertain. So this is quickly consider Europe, mindful of our esteemed guest. The EU ETS is really the only truly functioning mechanism currently driving action on climate change, and it also has a fundamental underpinning through the public reporting of those entities that have to report through the consolidated database. Now, in addition to the way that the European countries will meet the 2020 commitments, individual member states are also having to set their own strategies. Now, the one that I'm most familiar with is the UK's carbon reduction commitment, which is designed to capture high users of energy that nonetheless fall outside of the EU ETS. The reason I mention these two examples are not simply, well, it's firstly because they provide models for us to consider locally. But secondly, Hong Kong companies are already being impacted by them. So specifically, Cathay Pacific, as it has to report its GHG emissions for its flights into and out of Europe. And companies such as Hudson Whampoa, HSBC, and others have to report to the UK government under the carbon reduction commitment. So already we can see there are a handful of companies that are ready to meet whatever requirements may be demanded in this region. So let's just have a think about what some of those requirements may be. Again, the Commissioner has already mentioned the 12th five-year plan. So again, for all the failings of energy intensity and focus on that rather than absolute reduction, we know that in relation to China's GDP, energy intensity has been mandated to reduce by 16% over the next five-year period, and carbon intensity reduced by 17%. We heard today about Hong Kong's moving from the 50–60% intensity to the 19 to 30% absolute reduction, which is to be welcomed. Now, how companies will achieve, or organizations and governments will achieve this is through a mix of measures. So we know that in China, for the big users of energy, there will be a continuing command and control system whereby large organizations have certain emissions reductions mandated. But also there will be new forms of taxation and carbon markets. All of these things, again, are built upon a sound reporting basis. I think interestingly across the region we're seeing now stock exchanges getting more involved. So in addition to Beijing's ongoing, Shanghai's stock exchange ongoing consultation at the moment, where they're considering making all listed companies report on emissions in keeping with the GRI Global Reporting Protocols. We're also seeing Malaysia has now released guidelines, and Singapore Stock Exchange has released guidelines. The interesting thing about Singapore is, firstly, they've said that companies, these guidelines will move from being voluntary to mandatory. But secondly, Singapore is just now beginning to build a centralized database through which large organizations will have to report on their energy use and associated carbon emissions, thus allowing the Singapore government to begin to really manage their overall carbon emissions. In Hong Kong Stock Exchange, as many people here will know, is currently undergoing a period of consultation. And while the steer is that they will be fairly accessible guidelines, at least in the initial years, we have to consider what the outcomes might be as we see stock exchanges around the region beginning to toughen up on this area. One area that is very much market related but is nonetheless purely voluntary at the moment, is the Carbon Disclosure Project. The CDP represents it's 500, almost 600 investors with assets of over $71 trillion under management. A couple of interesting things about this. One is that, well, first let me just start with China and Hong Kong. Only 20 companies, 10 Chinese, 10 in Hong Kong, reported in the 2010 CDP emissions CDP report. But where governments begin to take action, we see an immediate spike in the voluntary reporting through CDP. So we've seen that in Taiwan and Korea last year. The other thing that I think is interesting to note is that of all the companies that reported last year, 61, now it is only 61, but that's a lot more than the 31 in 2009, have said that they are currently either actively involved in carbon trading or would like to use carbon trading as a means to manage greenhouse gas emissions. So alongside that, we've already had some mention of the sort of regions and interest in carbon trading. I know Guangdong as well as Hebei are lobbying Beijing very hard to be allowed to make early starts in carbon trading. So what we're witnessing is a certain amount of market interest in trading and reporting, a willingness to do so, but we're currently lacking certainty and frameworks in order for organizations to participate. So just quickly, in summing up, moving to what is needed, I would say that, as I say, the EU ETS, and my guess would be the Commissioner, you may agree that the EU ETS is not entirely perfect, but nonetheless, it does provide what is known as an investment-grade policy, i.e. you can actually make investments and you can begin to work out your return on investment on the basis of this policy. So, you know, this is a very important thing to think about. Europe as a whole is certainly ahead of the game, but I think probably still has a long way to go. So the Environmental Investment Organization said that fewer than 300 of Europe's largest companies publicly disclose and have verified their carbon or GHG data. I think that locally there is a real opportunity for Hong Kong and administrations in the broader region to really begin to set the agenda. I think that one thing that comes to my mind, I have asked myself, is given Hong Kong's role as the center of trade and of finance, where is Hong Kong's position on carbon trading? Why is it not more visible, more forward-looking? So, in summing up, as I say, so there's a clear direction in terms of the kind of action that is being taken or where we will be heading in terms of addressing climate change and the associated greenhouse gas reporting required to deliver it. I think the governments, markets, and ultimately us as citizens all require more robust, more transparent, and centrally collated reporting. And finally, that for Hong Kong to both to maintain and indeed to build upon its international competitiveness, we need to see clear regulation and legislation that is not just about taxation, but that facilitates action, fosters innovation. I think this will become ever more important over time, but really to keep up, let alone to lead. I think the time for Hong Kong to act is now.